I'm your sister. The black waitress tells a billionaire, what he did next will shock you. What if everything you thought defined your success was built on a lie you never knew existed? The marble floors of the restaurant gleamed under crystal chandeliers as guests in tailored suits and silk dresses floated between tables, their laughter echoing off walls adorned with paintings worth more than most people's homes. At the center of it all stood a man who owned not just his restaurant, but 12 others across 3 states, a man whose name appeared regularly in business magazines beside words like self-made and unstoppable. His custom Italian shoes clicked against the floor as he moved through the dining room, nodding at familiar faces, shaking hands with investors, playing the role he perfected over 2 decades. But tonight, one voice would cut through all that polished perfection like a knife through silk. A voice that would remind him of a past he'd worked so hard to bury, a truth he convinced himself didn't matter anymore. Sometimes the hardest conversations don't announce themselves with warning bells or flashing lights. Sometimes they start with 3 simple words from a stranger's mouth, and everything you thought you knew begins to crumble. Where are you watching from tonight? The evening had started like any other Tuesday at his flagship location, the crown jewel of his restaurant empire. He'd arrived at 6, as he always did, walking through the kitchen first to ensure every station met his exacting standards. The chefs barely looked up anymore, accustomed to his silent inspections, the way he'd run his finger along a counter checking for dust or taste of sauce without asking permission. Control was his language, perfection his only acceptable outcome. His life ran on schedules and systems, everything measured and managed, no room for chaos or surprise. At 4-2, he'd built this empire from absolutely nothing. Also, he told everyone who asked. The story was polished smooth from years of repetition, how he'd started washing dishes at 16, worked his way up through sheer determination, saved every penny until he could open his first small place. Investors loved the narrative, the bootstrap mythology that made America's heart swell with pride. What he never mentioned was the family he'd left behind in that journey, the people whose names he gradually stopped saying out loud until they became ghosts he no longer acknowledged. She'd been working there for 3 weeks, one of a rotating cast of servers who came and went like seasons. He barely noticed the staff unless they made mistakes, and she'd been careful not to make any. Quiet, efficient, always exactly where she needed to be with impeccable timing. She carried herself differently than the others. He'd observed from a distance, something about the way she held her shoulders straight despite the exhaustion that showed around her eyes. She was 36, though worry had aged her face beyond those years, her dark hands moving with practiced grace as she balanced multiple plates, navigating between tables without ever appearing rushed. The other servers whispered about her sometimes, how she'd requested this occasion specifically, how she always volunteered for Tuesday evening shifts even though Fridays brought better tips. But he didn't listen to gossip, didn't concern himself with the personal lives of employees whose names he rarely bothered to learn. She was number 43 in his mental filing system, efficient and invisible, exactly how he preferred his staff. That night she approached his usual corner table where he sat reviewing next quarter's projections on his tablet, numbers glowing in neat columns that told him everything he needed to know about success. She refilled his water glass without being asked, the ice cubes clinking softly, and he grunted acknowledgement without looking up. But she didn't leave. She stood there, tray tucked under her arm, and when he finally glanced up with irritation pulling at his mouth, ready to ask what she needed, she spoke 3 words that stopped his heart. I'm your sister. The words hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to unsee once released. His fingers froze above the tablet screen, his carefully constructed evening suddenly tilting sideways into territory he wasn't prepared to navigate. She didn't say anything else, just stood there meeting his eyes with a steadiness that dared him to look away, to pretend he hadn't heard, to dismiss her like he dismissed everything else that didn't fit into his organized world. For a long moment he couldn't speak, couldn't think beyond the roaring in his ears that sounded like ocean waves or maybe just panic. His mind rifled through possibilities, excuses, ways to categorize this disruption into something manageable. A scam, he thought first, some elaborate scheme to extort money from a wealthy man. People tried things like that, didn't they? He'd heard stories of false paternity claims, long-lost relatives crawling out of woodwork when they smelled money. But something about her face stopped that explanation cold, something about the shape of her nose and the set of her jaw that he recognized like looking into a mirror that reflected back both past and present. She had her mother's eyes, He realized with a jolt that felt like touching a live wire, that same particular shade of brown with gold flecks near the pupil. Their mother who died 12 years ago, a fact he'd learned from a newspaper obituary he'd stumbled across by accident and then carefully folded up and thrown away without attending the funeral. His throat felt tight, words stuck somewhere between his chest and his mouth, and all he could manage was a harsh whisper that came out more like accusation than question. "What do you want?" She pulled out the chair across from him without waiting for invitation, her uniform rustling as she sat down, exhaustion and determination warring across her features. The dining room continued its elegant dance around them, conversations and laughter and clinking silverware providing cover for this collision of worlds. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a photograph, creased and worn from handling, colors faded with age. It showed 2 children on a porch, summer bright behind them, a little girl maybe 7 holding the hand of a teenage boy who wasn't quite smiling at the camera. He recognized that porch, that house, that version of himself before he'd learned to armor everything soft into steel. "I don't want anything," she said quietly, and her voice carried the kind of tired honesty that comes from people who've run out of energy for pretending. "I just wanted you to know I existed. I wanted you to see me, just once, before it didn't matter anymore." She worked 2 other jobs besides this one, she told him, her words coming slow and measured like she'd rehearsed them 1,000 times. A morning shift at a nursing home, evening cleaning offices after this restaurant closed. 3 kids at home, 2 boys and a girl, ages ranging from 8 to 14. Their father had left 4 years ago, disappeared one Tuesday morning and never came back, leaving nothing but debt and a hole in their lives shaped like broken promises. He should have felt something. He knew that intellectually, recognized that normal people would respond with empathy or curiosity or even anger. But he'd spent so long building walls between himself and anything that felt like weakness that now, faced with this woman who claimed his blood, he felt only a desperate need to protect the life he'd constructed. "You can't just show up and drop something like this," he said, his voice low and sharp, aware of the diners around him who might overhear. "I don't know what you think this is, but I have a life that doesn't include complications from the past." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected exactly this response, and something about her resignation made him feel smaller than any insult could have. She stood up, smoothing her apron, tucking the photograph back into her pocket. "I know who you are," she said softly. "I've always known. Mama talked about you sometimes, before she got too sick. She said you were going to do something big with your life, and she was right. I'm proud of you, even if you can't be anything to me." She walked away then, back to her section, back to refilling water glasses and taking orders, leaving him alone with his tablet and his projections and a feeling in his chest like something had cracked that he couldn't quite seal back up. He didn't sleep that night. He went home to his downtown penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, poured himself expensive bourbon that tasted like nothing, and stood staring at his own reflection in the dark glass. He'd left home at 18, driven by ambition and something sharper he'd never named, maybe shame about where he came from or anger at circumstances he couldn't control. His father had died when he was 15, leaving their mother to raise 4 kids on a grocery store clerk salary that never quite stretched far enough. He'd been the oldest, the one who was supposed to help, but instead he'd seen staying as a trap that would swallow his dreams whole. So he'd left, promised himself he'd send money once he made it big, and then somehow years passed and the promises faded into excuses. By the time he opened his first restaurant, his younger siblings were strangers whose birthdays he couldn't remember, and his mother was a voice he avoided on the rare occasions she called. He convinced himself it was necessary, this severing, that successful people didn't let family obligations drag them backward. Now, standing in his expensive apartment, surrounded by all the markers of achievement, he wondered when exactly he'd traded being a person for being a brand. The next Tuesday she wasn't there. He noticed her absence immediately, caught himself scanning the dining room for her face before he could stop the impulse. He called the manager over, asked about her in a casual tone that fooled nobody. She requested Fridays going forward, the manager said, checking his scheduling tablet. Said Tuesday evenings weren't working with her other jobs in the mall. It was a clear message. He understood that. She'd said what she needed to say and was now removing herself from his life, expecting nothing, asking for nothing, just quietly stepping back into whatever difficult circumstances she managed daily. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to loss, a hollow sensation he couldn't name or categorize or solve with better systems. He had her employment file pulled, told himself he just wanted to verify the information, make sure she was legitimate. The address listed was in a part of town he never visited, a neighborhood where buildings sagged and hope came in smaller increments. He found himself driving there on Wednesday afternoon, telling himself he was just curious about employee living situations, knowing he was lying even to himself. The apartment building was exactly what he expected and somehow was, paint peeling off in long strips, concrete steps cracked and uneven, windows covered with mismatched curtains or aluminum foil. He sat in his car across the street, the German engine purring softly, air conditioning keeping him separate from the summer heat that pressed down on everything outside. Children played in the narrow yard, their laughter bright against the tired landscape, and he watched a boy maybe 10 running between them with a basketball that had seen better days. The boy had his jawline. He realized with a start that same stubborn set to his chin. His nephew, the word felt foreign in his mouth when he tried it silently, a relationship he'd never considered claiming. He watched the apartment door open, and she emerged, work uniform already on though her shift didn't start for 2 hours. She called something to the children, her voice carrying warmth and authority, and they waved without stopping their game. She locked the door carefully, checked it twice, then started walking toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. He could see the exhaustion in every step, the weight she carried that had nothing to do with physical load and everything to do with responsibility that never took a break. He drove to the restaurant, parked in his reserved spot, walked into his domain where everything operated according to his specifications. But the numbers on his quarterly projections suddenly looked different, hollow somehow, measures of success that didn't account for children who needed things he'd never had to worry about. His phone buzzed with messages from investors, partners, people who wanted pieces of his empire, and he ignored all of them. Instead, he opened his laptop and looked at his bank accounts, the accumulated wealth of 20-plus years of relentless work, numbers that kept growing larger because he never spent on anything except maintaining his image. He thought about his nephews and niece growing up in that apartment with peeling paint, riding buses to schools that probably didn't have enough books or teachers who'd already given up. He thought about his sister working 3 jobs just to keep them fed, her body aging faster than years should allow, her dreams if she'd ever had any long since sacrificed on the altar of survival. And he thought about himself at their ages, how desperately he'd wanted out, how he promised himself he'd never be trapped by poverty or obligation. He'd achieved that, succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. But somewhere in that achievement, he'd also succeeded in becoming someone who could look at his own blood struggling and feel nothing except inconvenience. That Friday he went to the restaurant early, told himself he had paperwork that needed attention, knew he was waiting for her shift to start. She arrived exactly on time, tying her apron in the employee area, and when she saw him watching her, something flickered across her face, maybe resignation or maybe just weariness that someone else was going to make her life more complicated. He approached before he could reconsider, before his carefully constructed defenses could rebuild themselves. "Can we talk?" he asked, and his voice came out softer than he'd intended, almost uncertain. She glanced around the prep area, calculating whether she could afford to take time, and he found himself adding, "Please." They sat in his office with the door closed, the sounds of the kitchen muffled through the walls. He didn't know how to start, didn't have experience with apologies or vulnerability, so he just started talking. He told her about leaving, about the guilt that became easier to ignore as years passed, about convincing himself that success justified abandonment. He told her about seeing the obituary, about not going to their mother's funeral because he was afraid of exactly this, of being seen and found wanting. His words came out clumsy, unpracticed, but he kept going because stopping felt like drowning. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, and when he finally ran out of words, she sat quiet for a long moment. "I'm not here for your guilt," she finally said. "I didn't tell you who I was to make you feel bad or to get something from you. I just needed you to know that we existed, that we were real people who kept living after you left." Her voice stayed level, but he could hear everything underneath it. Decades of disappointment and struggle and determination to keep moving forward anyway. Mama never stopped hoping you'd come back, even at the end when she barely knew her own name. She'd ask for you, and I'd have to tell her you were busy. You'd come soon. I lied to her until she died, and I hated you for making me do that. The words should have felt like attacks, but instead they felt like truth, clean and necessary, cutting away what he'd let grow for too long. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, and it was maybe the first completely honest thing he'd said to anyone in years. "I don't know how to be family." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw his mother in her face again, that particular mix of fierce strength and stubborn hope. "Start by showing up," she said simply. "That's all anyone ever wanted from you. Just show up." The next Tuesday he drove to that apartment building again, but this time he got out of his car. He climbed those cracked concrete steps and knocked on a door that had been painted over so many times the numbers were barely visible. She opened it with surprise widening her eyes, and behind her he could see a small living room crowded with mismatched furniture and 3 faces turned toward him with suspicion and curiosity mixed together. "I brought dinner," he said, holding up bags from the restaurant, and it was a small thing, inadequate really, but it was something. She stood aside and let him in, and he walked into a home that smelled like laundry detergent and old carpet and something baking in the oven. The children stared at him like he was a creature from another planet, which maybe he was in his expensive suit and designer watch. He sat at a kitchen table that wobbled on uneven legs and ate fried chicken with people who were strangers and family all at once, and for the first time in decades something in his chest loosened just slightly. The conversation was awkward, full of stops and starts, but by the end of the meal his oldest nephew was telling him about basketball tryouts, and his niece was showing him drawings she'd made in art class. They didn't trust him yet. He could see that clearly, but they were willing to let him try, and that felt like more than he deserved. Over the following months he kept showing up. Tuesday dinners became a routine, then Sunday afternoons, then phone calls to check in and texts with photos of school events. He started paying attention to things he'd ignored for so long, noticing when his nephew needed new shoes or his niece wanted art supplies. He offered to help with college funds, to cover medical insurance, but his sister was proud and careful, unwilling to become dependent on money that might disappear as easily as he once had. So instead he showed up in smaller ways, fixing the apartment's broken window, being present at basketball games and school plays, slowly learning the rhythms of life that had continued without him. He wasn't good at it, fumbled constantly, said wrong things and miscues that more experienced family members would have caught. But he kept trying, kept showing up, kept learning that connection required something harder than money or success. His business associates noticed changes, asked why he wasn't available for evening meetings anymore, why he'd turned down expansion opportunities that would have required more time. He didn't know how to explain that he'd spent decades chasing something that turned out to matter less than he'd believed, that wealth without connection was just numbers on a screen, impressive but ultimately hollow. One evening 8 months after that first conversation, he sat with his sister on her small balcony after dinner, the kids inside arguing about television choices with the casual comfort of children who felt secure. The city lights spread out before them, the same view he had from his penthouse but somehow completely different from this angle, warmer and more real. "I can never make up for the years," he said quietly. "I know that. I can't give you back time or undo what I did." She was quiet for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "I don't need you to make up for anything," she said. "I just need you to be here now, to be real with us now. The past is done. We can only work with what's in front of us." And maybe that was the hardest lesson he'd learned in 42 years of living, that some mistakes couldn't be unmade, only learn from and move beyond. That showing up didn't erase the years of absence, but it created something new, built connection in the present that honored what should have been there all along. His nephew bounded onto the balcony then, asking about whether they could go to the game this weekend, and he found himself saying yes automatically, already rearranging his schedule in his head. The boy grinned and disappeared back inside, and his sister smiled at him, a real smile that reached her tired eyes and made her look younger, more like the girl in that old photograph. "You're getting better at this," she said, and it was the best compliment anyone had given him in years, worth more than any business award or magazine profile. He didn't know where this path would lead, couldn't project it into quarterly goals or measured outcomes. But sitting there on that small balcony with traffic sounds rising from the street below and family noise drifting through the open door, he felt something he'd chased unsuccessfully through all his achievements. He felt like he belonged to something bigger than himself, connected to people who saw past the success to the person underneath, flawed and learning and finally, slowly, willing to be seen. If this story touched your heart, Please like this video, share your own thoughts about family and second chances in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters in this life. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight.